Hey, thank you so much. I appreciate that. I appreciate this space. I appreciate all y'all online joining us in that platform. I appreciate that accessibility. I know that we have many in our communities who couldn't be here physically with us today. And so I want to be respectful of that and do my my hardest tonight to make sure that I speak loud enough for folks here in the space and for folks online as well to be able to hear this information. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I really do appreciate your presence. I know that this is an important issue. I also know we're still in some pretty precarious times, especially for our Native Indigenous communities. And so I also appreciate you making that effort to be here together. I appreciate that. So to get started, we're going to be talking about specifically SB 22-150, which was the legislative passage of a bill that's going to help us get the ball rolling here in Colorado, called the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives Bill, and establishes an office where we hope to centralize information, communication, accountability, and a resource for families and survivors to reach out to help folks navigate our very complex system. And hopefully we are working towards doing a better job for our Indigenous relatives across Colorado and in our neighboring states and territories. I wanted to introduce you all to my task force sisters. There are many movements right now, and I want to also start out giving that honor that this was started long before my time, and that there are many spaces of movement that are happening right now across what we call the United States and all over the world, quite honestly. So I want to always give that respect. And specifically for our task force, I want to give honor always to our neighboring nation, the Navajo Nation, and for the amazing advocates, mothers and sisters and family members there who started the Missing and Murdered Dene relatives, from whom we've taken their cue and always give gratitude to their work, their grassroots effort. Our task force was named after the work that they are doing, which we respect because it really promotes this idea of relatives, that it's inclusive, that we don't leave out anyone in our family circle, and that this is also across tribal nations and identities and communities, that this issue doesn't just impact families of folks who have lost their lives, to the many ways in which that happens to our family, to our relatives, but also to those of us in community, those of us in neighboring communities as well. So there's myself, Miss Kelsey, and our sisters Monica Snowbird, who does amazing work in her side of Colorado, in Colorado Springs, Raven Payment, who joined us during the bill work and is working from Denver, doing really amazing things as well, and did an amazing job doing the in-person lobbying and educating of our legislators across the aisle. I want to emphasize that we did not target any particular political party. This issue touches all of us. Ms. Christine Sage, who is a member of the Southern Ute Tribe and former chairwoman there, and Daisy, who unfortunately couldn't make it with us tonight, who is also Southern Ute and doing amazing work in a nonprofit in her community, and had been doing tireless efforts pretty much on her own up to this point, doing awareness, community organizing, all those amazing things, and using her voice, and oftentimes stood alone in doing that work. And so I always want to give that gratitude and respect to Miss Daisy, and we sent her well wishes. If she's watching us tonight, we're thinking of you, Daisy, and we're hoping you get better soon. So here's a quick blurb, better shot of me than how I'm looking right now. So I am a member of the Ute Mountain Tribe. I work for the Colorado Coalition Against Sexual Assault as the Rural and Indigenous Communities Manager. And in that role, I provide training and technical assistance to our member agencies across Colorado. But those requests have come from many supportive agencies outside of our state. We've done some really cool trainings for folks who've reached out from Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, really wanting to emphasize that this issue and our responsibility to each other as relatives really knows no state lines or barriers in that way. And so we continue to hold space for all of those communities and voices and experiences. I also facilitate a multi-tribal, multidisciplinary coalition called NAUHZCASA, which includes at least 5 tribal nations at this time in the Southwest region. I've been facilitating those meetings now for, I want to say, maybe 5 years or so. And that group has existed for over 12 years and was started by amazing women and our founding mothers who were nurses, who saw this lack of care for sexual assault survivors and their families. And so this group started around that work and is comprised of folks who work in tribal communities as advocates, healthcare providers, law enforcement, and other supportive agencies, and really is an amazing group to belong to. If you're interested, we always have an open door for folks to join in. We don't pretend to hold the stories and experiences of every Indigenous relative and community. If you would like to join in our meetings, please reach out to me and I'm happy to get you hooked up with that. We also are a space for survivors. So any particular role that you hold, even as a community member, if you'd like to be a part of that, I strongly encourage you to consider doing so. Here's a really cool blurb about our sister Daisy. I don't want to skip over all of her amazing accomplishments. I also want to emphasize that for tribal folks who were involved with the legislative committee that pushed this bill forward, for the folks who were members of the Ute tribes, were very instrumental in working to lift up and hold space for folks from other tribal identities throughout the state of Colorado. We had a lot of pressure to keep this issue very much targeted at the Ute tribal communities here in Colorado. But from the very beginning, we worked from a very concerned and intentional place that missing and murdered Indigenous relatives is not just something that impacts the Ute nations, and that Colorado is home to many tribal identities. And I know that on this campus, I'm speaking a lot to the choir. And so I want folks to understand that the folks who were involved in this legislative process, who were members of the Ute Mountain and Southern Ute Tribe, I think did an amazing job in the selflessness and the courage and the advocacy to our leaders to hold that space. And we're very proud of our leaders that they stood with us on that and did not allow for the state of Colorado to push this bill and this targeted audience to just the Southwest region. Though it's true, our Southwest region is home to many tribal nations and tribal communities. We really wanted to emphasize that every corner of Colorado should be addressed in this, should have a voice in this, should know that they hold a part in this, and for every Indigenous relative who may live in any corner of Colorado, understand that they are included, they are heard, they should be considered by all of our responders and systems folks. I want to start out, as we always should, giving honor and respect to the land. This is a quick blurb. I'm not going to give you a lesson on it. I know that we see that a lot happening lately, and it's such a really good feeling to know that more and more folks are working towards a stronger communication with the land. And I encourage folks who are not aware or are beginning your journey in this realm to look up resources that can help you understand this, so that you're doing this with intention, that we're not just doing land acknowledgements for the sake of land acknowledgement and to say that we are inclusive this way. I really hope that an important takeaway for those of you who do not belong to our Indigenous communities, to understand that you yourself also can play a part in this. You yourself can also do your work and your due diligence to educate yourself, and that there are so many helpful resources, more so today than I think I've seen in my life before. And there are amazing people in our communities who also can help you with that. I think you met a couple of the ladies here today who are happy to help you in your organization understand what this means and how to implement this in your organization in an intentional way. And this is just probably some things you've seen in the media. This is what, this is just the start of what these folks are talking about, what they're calling for when they tell you about, or you see in their advocacy and their marches about land back. This is what we're talking about. Each of our task force sisters, we all sit in different communities across Colorado. And so we really worked to create our land acknowledgement that holds all of our, where we all live and work from here in Colorado. So I'll read you our land acknowledgement now. The Colorado Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives Task Force acknowledges the sacred lands and ancestral territories of the Nunchu, or the Utes, who are the longest continuous Indigenous inhabitants of what is now Colorado. We honor that a minimum of 48 federally recognized sovereign nations, that include the Dene or Navajo, Hickory, Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, also all have ties to this place and continue to foster their relationships with this land. I really wanted our conversation today to be really a conversation, a discussion between each other. Please feel free to engage. I think this is the only way that we can truly understand this issue, how we can truly stand with our Indigenous communities and our relatives, truly understand this intersectionality of this issue, which is that this is not just about missing and murdered. We have to also acknowledge our inequities, the injustices, the violences, and all of those kinds of experiences around this issue. I think I will speak for myself in this. In starting out, that was my main obstacle in stepping into this this movement. I come from a background in advocacy in victims of crime, and for me, I wasn't hearing at the time an emphasis or a conversation around the violences on our Native Indigenous bodies, the lack of justice from our systems folks, whether we're talking about tribal, federal, or local level, standing with survivors who were literally ignored by our systems, And even given those complexities of jurisdiction and who, what, where, what happened, and all of those pieces, this idea of sovereignty, as a survivor myself, I strongly emphasize and was frustrated by that. This word gets tossed around a lot, but how sovereignty feels on our bodies as survivors who've experienced violence is very different. It feels like an excuse not to do the right thing, an excuse not to keep me safe, keep our family safe, keep our relatives safe. And this feeling as if though our survivorship, our resiliency, our courage is oftentimes overlooked. And then this movement comes along, and I really was at a loss in seeing my experience and the experience of so many amazing survivors who came from every possible population in our community. I saw elders, I saw children, I saw women, I saw men, and everything that you could have imagined. Maybe by my second week on the job, I realized what they meant when they said under-resourced. I realized how outnumbered and how huge this issue was to the very humble and small program that I was managing. But I also give credit to the team that I supervised for holding that space for when we did. I feel that we did our best with what we had. And so when I was first introduced to the missing and murdered movement, I wondered, where is the conversation around survivorship and domestic violence and sexual violence and child abuse and child sexual abuse and elder abuse and all of these pieces. And it took the work of collaboration and being part of NAUHZCASA and meeting the folks who started the missing and murdered and their relatives to help me understand that these issues are absolutely intersectional, absolutely exist in the missing and murdered movement. And if it's such a hardship for me to see, that maybe I need to step in it and make sure that happens, right? So I really wanted to start out with a question for you all. What does missing and murdered mean to you? Or how do you understand it? Please feel free to share what your thoughts are, your experiences around it, and I promise you there are absolutely no wrong answers here. Sure. Justice? Injustice. Absolutely. In what ways? Failures to see Indigenous peoples, is that what I'm hearing? Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, failures to see us as Indigenous peoples. I'm not going to answer for you, but I absolutely agree. A failure to see us as worthy of justice, worthy of being seen, worthy of being heard, perhaps even worthy of being safe, right? Anyone else? For those of you who just joined us, I'm just asking kind of what you, when you think of missing and murdered, and when you think about this movement, what does that bring up for you? Someone has shared all the children who don't have moms anymore. Absolutely. Yeah, thank you, appreciate that. Yeah, all of the relatives and children left behind, right? Kelsey?
You have the one on
Strength, resiliency, and hope in this movement. Beautiful. A way in which that we can lift up our voices in these experiences, right? A way that we can address that injustice that it feels like, that feeling of being left out, not being seen, not being heard. When you see these ways of showing up and calling these things out, I hope that you ask questions and you have discussions at home around this, right? When we started this work in my community many years back, we were questioned a lot by our community about why we were even talking about this. Like this isn't happening in our community. This has nothing to do with us, right? That's also true that we still struggle with that in our communities. We still struggle with that with each other, right? We still have those internal ways in which we're navigating these very hard realities. And I encourage each other, and even speaking to myself, right? That's also a part of where this issue comes from, what it's rooted in. We'll navigate that here in a few slides. Does anybody else have anything else you want to share at this point? Go for it.
There's a lot of ignorance within the police department, and there's a stereotype called the drunken Indian.
Sure.
And if we get seen by the police department, if there's an opportunity out there to be seen, they will regard us as they're off to a party, or they ran away to like a drunken festival, to a music festival, and not really missing or murdered.
I appreciate that. Very important points. This person shared the way in which we are viewed. I don't want to put words in your mouth. I'll absolutely bring you the mic if I'm missing anything. The way in which we're viewed by police. This assumption that we are drunks, that we must have been on our way to a party, that we in our own behavior and choices we make, right, are the reasons why these things happen to us. Those assumptions and stereotypes and biases and judgments, right? Which is a hard thing to hear, right? Especially when we're talking about our public safety folks. You're there to protect us, all of us, right? And we oftentimes are hesitant to come to these folks for help. And that's exactly what they're supposed to be there for, right? But when we know that they are sitting with these assumptions about us, these prejudgments, it's for that reason as well. I manage an emergency fund in my position for survivors of sexual violence who choose not to report or have reported and their case has been decided not to move forward for whatever reason, and that happens all the time, to help folks kind of find some ways, some stepping stones. It's not going to do everything. It's not going to heal everything, but at least there's something that's for you, because oftentimes folks who are survivors don't get access to any type of support or funding if their case isn't reported or if it's not going to go through our system. They have to also be kind of authorized, authenticated that their violence happened. And that's something I manage. So please feel free to pass that word along in your communities to your relatives if something like that is happening and they are in that situation, that they can reach out to me. I do not capture identifying information. They do not need to prove to me that they are Native or Indigenous, because that's what it takes. It takes for us to push through those assumptions, those barriers, authentication, right? Are you really native? Are you really indigenous? Do you have a tribal ID card? There's many reasons why we will not meet those standards, right? And as somebody who advocated and stood with survivors, I've heard it all as well. And especially through COVID, we had a very hard time with our survivors from our Indigenous and Native communities, finding shelter, being seen by even the service providers who were supposed to be there for all survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence, and were not being seen because of a fear that we somehow were carrying maybe a more transmittable form of COVID or whatever. They did not want our people in their shelter. They did not want to be in contact with us, which is something we've been through before as Native people, right? We've been through this this kind of treatment. We've been through pandemic, right? Some would argue we're probably still living in one, right? Does anyone else have anything else to share here? Sure.
I just want to ask what you were saying, you know, in describing, you know, like the NMIW and NMIR, you know, the first thing that comes to mind is that it's an epidemic crisis, you know, for families, for victims, for their families. And like, you know, she had said their children, you know, these children are going without families, without their parents or their mother, their aunt or their grandma, you know, and a lot of people don't see it as a crisis. You know, it's an outbreak of people who are going missing and nothing is being done. There's probably some stuff being done, but majority, it's definitely an epidemic.
Absolutely. This person shares this is an epidemic, right? The impact on families, the children who are left behind, the impact of the families. When we lose someone in our families and in our communities, it's not just that home that feels that loss. We feel it as a people. Especially, I want to lift that up for all of our Native folks that, you know, we are still a very precious few. Some of our tribal nations fewer than others, right? That we are a very precious few people, and when we lose somebody, it's like losing 1,000 of us. Right? We are in this system of erasure that is coming for us in every kind of way, whether it's documentation, whether it's blood quantum, whether it's violence, whether it's missing and murdered, right? We are very precious few, and those losses are felt. Absolutely. If I didn't capture everything you said, I truly apologize. Anyone else have anything to share? I will definitely open this back up and have opportunities. Go ahead.
I come from Montana, Fort Peck Reservation, and just in Montana, there's over 5,000 missing Indigenous persons. Only over 5,000 only in Montana. Imagine how many more Indigenous people are missing and murdered, go unnoticed throughout the United States.
Thank you for sharing that with me, brother. He says he's from Montana. Right now, 5,000 just in Montana are missing. I appreciate you for bringing that forward. And we'll sit in space for those and pray for their return. Thank you. It's a staggering number. He also mentions that's just Montana. What about everywhere else? What about here, right? I'll get to it. I have some numbers for you to look at. But even that, right? Hold on. We're going to move forward. Please feel free to, like I said, we're here in conversation with each other. I know the setup is super weird. But absolutely. And for folks online, you know, go ahead, and we have folks monitoring the chat for you all. So please feel free to engage where you can and where you feel comfortable. I'm not a history teacher, but absolutely our history is important. people want to contextualize how we got here and how we exist, as if though this was some faraway frontier. I don't very much like that word. Memory. But all of these pieces, all of these policies, all of these legislative actions are what frame how we exist today, how we move through this world. We had to be granted visibility. We had to be granted rights. We had to be granted voice. We had to be granted ways in which we counted, right? The Removal Act took us from our homelands. With the ways in which we hold relationship with our lands, that was a very devastating and traumatic way to weaken any people. These were lands that we had held since always, and then being removed by decision of a government to decide what was better for us, that there was a better location for us. Removed us from our medicines, our ceremonial grounds, where our ancestors were in ceremony, where they were laid to rest, where we lived in joy and harmony, where we hunted, where we could nurture ourselves and live in health and took care of each other, held each other accountable, had understandings with our land. The Indian Citizenship Act, for folks who've been here since always, had to be granted that visibility that we are citizens now of this country. The Relocation Act, which was to help assimilate us into this understanding of what was to be the superior way for us to live. Many different ways, the efforts put there for us to leave our traditional ways behind, to leave our ancestors' ways behind. Our right to vote. For those of y'all who may not be students of the amazing instructor we have here with us, here in Colorado, our youth people couldn't vote until 1970. That's not that long ago, folks. Not that long ago at all. We still struggle with that today in our youth communities, folks feeling as if though ballots and voting includes them. I see less and less more of this, but there was a lot of recycling bin in our post office full of ballots in our state and local elections. These are folks who decide things that impact our lives, and our people didn't see ourselves in that. I'm happy that folks are taking that up a little bit more seriously, but I promise you, it was not that long ago when people in my own community tossed those ballots and did not see the significance of it. The right to ceremony, the right to be with each other in ceremony, which we all know as Indigenous people is very pivotal and foundational to who we are. Kelsey? There's a question about ICWA and MMIW. Would it lead to increase in MMIW? Or would ICWA be a harm that increases MMIW? I promise you I have better listening skills than I do tonight. So ICWA, right? That's an important topic right now. ICWA is the Indian Child Welfare Act. Again, I don't pretend to be a teacher or professor, all of those things. But as Indigenous people, especially if you live in your tribal community, I encourage you to understand these pieces, and I'm not surprised if you don't know them, because there is a very intentional effort to not include this in our education growing up in our local school systems. That's another argument for another day, right? The Indian Child Welfare Act. This was, as I understand it, folks, please jump in if you understand this a little bit differently. Was a way in which tribes could have a say in where children were going to be placed who found their way into social services or the foster care system. Up until this point, and I don't know that this is necessarily hitting all of the protections that we wish we had for our kiddos, but children were kind of placed out wherever. And again, with those policies and viewpoints of what is a better way in which to live our lives, and that effort to assimilate us, certainly those efforts were to put our children into non-Indigenous homes, into majority white homes. So to continue that effort to assimilate our Native Indigenous people. And what better way to do that than to start with with us when we're very, very young. ICWA was a way in which we could at least make efforts to place these children into homes within the tribal community, or at least into Native homes, so that these children would have connection to culture, at least be in a home environment that was conducive to, at some point, reconnecting with their families and their people. If I miss anything, please jump in. And we see right now, as I understand it, there is going to be a challenge to this. And if you pay close attention, there is an intention to take away all of these pieces all the time. All the time that's going on. It sounds as if though this is in jeopardy of being reversed or taken away altogether, in which case tribes would have no say in where kiddos would be placed, which is traumatic. Who knows where these kids will go? We have far too many reports of kiddos and young people being placed out and going missing from the system, going missing from their families, winding up dead, being neglected and abused, which is interesting, since a system wants to decide that these are better homes than our Native homes, that this would end up happening to our kiddos, right? This is why these children were placed out in the first place, supposedly. That's my own personal viewpoint. I'll add that little asterisk. The boarding school era. This was that effort to kill the Indian, save the man. Again, assimilate us, take us as small children, put us into these boarding schools that were oftentimes military style, military schools, to teach us in that stringent way, to kind of work that Native Indigenous out of us. We see that that a lot of our young people were unceremoniously buried at these schools. We're still going through and reclaiming these children and returning them to their families, to their people. To this day, we don't know even that number, right? Again, it's the not knowing. I ask folks who are working towards being allies and accomplices to sit with that, to not know where your family member is, to not know what happened to them, to have seen them one day and then never to hear from them again. Whether they were taken, whether it was through violence, how would that impact you and your family, your belief system, right? And I want you to pay close attention to the years in which we're talking about in that era. That's been going on for a long time to our Native Indigenous people, a long time. Right? And then VAWA 2013 was the start of giving tribes some jurisdiction over non-Indigenous, non-tribal members who cause harm where domestic violence and sexual violence occurs in our tribal communities. I want to celebrate that as a win, I really do. But when you read the fine print of this act, they're asking that in order for tribes to do that, they need to have a working criminal justice system within their own community, affording defendants proper counsel, affording them their rights, making sure that a jury of their peers also can be available to hear their case. Only when all of those I's are dotted and T's are crossed can tribes be able to say that they can implement this and hold non-Indigenous, non-tribal offenders, folks who cause harm in their communities accountable. So yes, here's a right back, and here's the stack that you need to be able to overcome in order to do that, right? One step forward, maybe a baby step, right? Go for it.
Is it okay if I?
Sure.
Okay. So I'm from Hickory, Apache. Hi, Gloria. So we do have victims of crime with domestic violence and sexual assault cases with non-tribal members. They do arrest them, but they can't keep them because they're not tribal.
Mm-hmm.
So they drop them off at our tribal boundary.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why is because our judicial system is not, I guess you would say, certified
Sure.
in order to practice VAWA, even though we do have these cases
Mm-hmm.
happening, I would say, every month.
Mm-hmm.
And in order, they literally drop them off at the reservation border
Mhm.
because we can't prosecute them.
Mm-hmm.
Because our prosecutor, our defense, they don't have, and our judges too, they don't have that background or certification, or they, to practice VAWA. So a lot of these cases
Mm-hmm.
don't really go anywhere
Sure.
for that. And it is a good thing, to have, but like you said, the fine print underneath is what limits our justice to our victims.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. This person is sharing that in their tribe. So okay, if I share that, Hickory, absolutely should be proud of that. I love your lands. Y'all are always so welcoming, and I appreciate every time I've been able to visit. Has shared that they're able to arrest non-tribal offenders, non-Indians as well. Non-Indians as well. And the extent in which they can hold that person accountable, if you can call it that, is these folks get a ride to the reservation line, to their boundaries, and then these folks are let go. And that is the extent in which their nation is able to hold folks accountable, even though they do have a criminal justice system in place, but that the requirements of that system, that court system and the court officers is in such a way that is it. They do not hold any other way in which to hold these folks accountable. So these are, I don't like to label people, because I do, again, believe that we are in relationship. We do need to address violence in our communities. But these are folks who have caused harm, who are just being kind of let out at the border of the reservation line. What's to stop them from coming back? Right? Is that justice? Is that enough? But that is the extent in which even a functioning tribal criminal justice system can go. Even with this piece here, they cannot enact this because they just don't have those pieces in that fine print there. The fine print's important always. Did you have something else to share?
Yes, the boarding school era
Mm.
is still hurting our communities with the cultural genocide, the transgenerational trauma we suffer from generation to generation,
Mhm.
the simulation.
Mhm.
And when a child first gets there, their hair gets
Mhm.
drenched with kerosene and washed with DDT powder.
Mhm.
And the Canadian model of reconciliation, there's multiple boarding schools within Canada,
Mhm.
and they found at least 2 schools of 99% of the student body that passed through that school had been sexually abused.
Mhm.
And in America, there's over 410 boarding schools within America.
Mhm.
So imagine the pain we suffer as communities.
Mhm. Thank you for that. Absolutely. He's gone into depth to talk about what was experienced and continues to be impactful in our communities from this boarding school era. What those young children were put through when they were brought there, their hair being cut. If you haven't heard this before, folks, hair is very sacred to us as Native Indigenous people. Oftentimes you would only do that if you lost somebody very close to you. And to imagine these children being taken by force and having their hair cut, being doused with kerosene, and being washed with DDT, very dangerous chemicals, right? These are children. Very intentional efforts to shame us of our identity, to remove us from who we are, or what they call assimilation. The sexual violence, the physical violence, the spiritual violence that these children endured, and for the folks who made it through that and made it back home to their communities, bringing with them those harms that they survived, that they learned. Those are things that are still impacting us in our communities also to this day. Right. Thank you for sharing that. Absolutely.
Another thing is language.
Language.
Our cultural language
Yes.
has
Absolutely.
been devastated, destroyed to like a point of extinction.
Yeah, language. Also, the abuses and punishment in these schools to speak that. Up until we reported that right, we couldn't not only be in ceremony, but speak our words. Illegal. Got in trouble for that, right? And in our young people, that's when they learn our language, and that the way it was removed from us, our culture. And go ahead.
They go as far as putting needles inside of our tongues to stop speaking our language.
Needles into young children's tongues to stop them from speaking those words. And we wonder today why we struggle, right, with our language. I myself, I do not speak my language. Maybe in conversation with some of my elders, they bring it out in me, right? And how hard that is for us, because again, circle back to how this has rooted inside of our communities, that our young people are oftentimes criticized for not knowing our language, right? We thirst for that. But I oftentimes share that, and I think I said this just earlier, if it was, when we talk about what happened when young folks tried to speak their language, but I think about all the time and give myself some grace around that, because I believe strongly that my parents and their parents were very strong in their parents. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here. Our grandparents and their grandparents did what they had to do to survive. They were being punished for speaking their words, and there's a reason why some of us struggle with that language piece, why some of us will never connect back to that piece. But to give ourselves some grace around that was part of survival. It came at a cost. But I want to extend that to those of us who are on that journey. It came from a very intentional place that you don't know those words and that you struggle with that. I hope that you find empowerment, that it's okay. I hope that you understand, and this is something that I share with young people in my community, who I've seen openly questioned by our elders about why they themselves don't know our language. That Creator hears you and hears your heart. That your words, your prayers, they're Ute, they're Navajo, they're Apache, they're whatever you are, because you are. And don't let anybody ever tell you any different. And if you need reminding, you can come ask Auntie Gina, and I'll give it to you again. These are going to be some really hard words, but I want to assure you that we as Native Indigenous people are very strong people, and this is nothing new to us, right? This is a journal entry from folks who participated in Columbus's expedition to what is understood to be the Americas. He writes, "While I was in the boat, I captured a very beautiful woman whom the Lord Admiral or Columbus gave to me. When I had taken her to my cabin, she was naked, as was their custom. I was filled with a desire to take my pleasure with her and attempted to satisfy my desire. She was unwilling and so treated me with her nails that I wish I had never begun. I then took a piece of rope and whipped her soundly. And she let forth such an incredible scream that you would not have believed your ears. Eventually we came to such terms, I assure you, that you would have thought she had been brought up in a school for whores. Are women being seen as objects? Explorers believing that they could trade us and give us away to each other. This violation, this violence, this belief that folks have a right to our bodies and accessibility to us, that we didn't have a voice or humanity, consent, right? It goes way back to the very beginning. As we are approaching what we now understand to be Thanksgiving, right? I know that in my school, I was taught about the Pilgrims, how we sat as friends. Absolutely, I never heard this part, right? I don't put this forward for us to sit in this trauma. I put this forward so that we can continue to have these conversations in our homes with our young people so they don't forget. We don't learn about these things in school for a reason. They're going to say it's because we don't want our kids to be introduced to violence. We don't want some of our kids to be ashamed. But it's the truth, right? This is what happened. This is what happens still. When I read this, what I hear are elements of trafficking, right? Sexual assault, the selling and commodifying of bodies, something we see in movies as if it were some faraway experience. Native Indigenous people have known those types of violences since always. Right? I want us to see that we have survived countless betrayals and atrocities. And I'm so blessed to be with you here today. And I appreciate you all for what it took for your families to get you here and for what you will do to continue to move forward. I have one more for you. Columbus himself, in a letter, wrote, there are plenty of dealers who would go about looking for girls. Those from 9 to 10 are now in demand. And for all ages, a good price must be paid. Trafficking, right? It's not a faraway concept for us. Go ahead.
Another significant violator is George Custer, whose jockstrap is in one of a museum of a national museum. And during California genocidal campaigns in the 1870s through the 1900s, even the elderly women were not spared from the wrath.
Yeah. He lifts up and doesn't want us to forget to recognize Custer, right? Who is in some communities celebrated for his bravery, but also took part in these atrocities. That elderly women were not an exception to these violations. Thank you for lifting that up. We cannot forget these truths. There are many efforts that are going to ask us to let this go. I was asked once at our museum in Montrose, which is a number of hours from my community, you would need to own a very good car from my community to be able to come visit that museum that's supposed to honor us and our culture. How did I forgive white people for what they've done? It's an interesting question. Up until that point, I'd never even been asked that, actually. I told him, how do you know that I have? Thank you for visiting our museum, and I hope you left a donation. Forgiveness, boy. Ooh. I'm sure folks want to see that happen, right? Some reconciliation. You see this, read these things. These are in their own words, in their own handwritings, what they did. We're going to move into some data pieces, but I want to always preface when we start talking about data and numbers, a little bit what we alluded to. We don't know that these are all of them. And this comes from people who are actually looking, people who are actually trying to find out. And every day that passes, it's old data, right? Which is great. That's great. This isn't stagnant at all, but I want us to look at this, this list of the top 10 cities. These are numbers of cases that are not in law enforcement records for whatever reason. You notice our communities are named here, right? Some of us have families who live there, who shop there. Colorado is no exception. This is in 2016, everybody. We hope to keep continuing to update these slides and these numbers, and definitely give respect and thanks to the folks who gathered this information, continue to gather this information and hold these stories, and hope that they continue those efforts. It's tireless, it's difficult. Folks don't want to share this information with us. Oftentimes we have to rely on the stories within our communities of families who say, don't forget my relative. Them too, right? Again, I'm not gonna bombard you. We just recently updated, these pieces. NAUHZCASA is, it's a national database. They have 780, here in the US. 6 of those here for Colorado. MMIW USA, that it's its own, organization and data effort. And you see that their numbers are also changing, but what I want you to pay attention to is that they don't even have numbers matching each other. So though these folks are gathering data, there is no centralized way in which folks are gathering this information, and that in order to see this picture, we have to gather from as many places as possible and hope that we are somewhere close to that. But as our good brother here brought up, in Montana, that number they have there, 6,000, right? Where are they here? Right? I'm not going to call out any of these organizations for doing their best efforts to gather this. There's many reasons why data shows up the way it shows up and doesn't show up at all, right? So let's talk about what is missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. Please excuse my my grammar. English is not my language, which is always my excuse about everything. So, as we discussed, missing and murdered has been happening throughout contact, through colonization, from the very moment the explorers got here, right? This movement began and originated with the First Nations people in Canada and up in the north. We always give that honor. They initiated this. They gathered together, truly grassroots effort, and continue to push this movement forward. And we continue to stand in solidarity with those folks, with those relatives, and thank them for carving out this pathway that we walk in today, especially as the task force. We never claim to be the ones who started anything. I'm absolutely the first to say that I was probably towards the end in stepping into it myself. And I appreciate the space that families have allowed me to be in with them, and hopefully continue to be in with them moving forward. In Canada, they've documented 582 cases since the 1960s, with 39% after 2000. So this movement was absolutely pivotal in bringing that attention there, impacting that reporting, that data piece. When you see folks marching and holding up their signs and at protests, those things work. That's how we have to get it done. All of these years of being overlooked, being told this isn't our issue, that's what it takes. And it's that movement, that grassroots effort that pushed these numbers forward and will continue to do so. Advocacy groups are saying that there are many more women who've been missing in Canada. Absolutely. And I encourage folks to look into the Highway of Tears, which was very pivotal to that movement there in the north. It's an important experience for you to familiarize yourself with. I will go into that piece, but I strongly encourage you to look into that. I spoke about this a little bit about the relatives. the relatives in our task force. We saw initially this was a movement that centered around our women, and it absolutely is. And then it started to expand as the movement expanded, as folks were collaborating together, and we were hearing more from relatives about whose family members we should also be looking for, we should be calling for justice for, to include our women and girls, Two-Spirit elders. And I really, again, always give that honor to the Dene community, that they encapsulated that in the missing and murdered Dene relatives movement, that they are working in their community. And from them, we call our task force actually it's the missing and murdered Indigenous relatives of Colorado task force. It's a very long name. But our work is absolutely grassroots. Advocates and mothers and sisters who came together to bring this awareness forward, to focus these voices and this issue for Colorado to get this ball rolling. But we absolutely do not represent every single one of you, every single Indigenous community here in Colorado. We hope that we started a pathway for folks to push forward, because I absolutely hope that in this campus, even there is somebody walking here who's going to push this work forward past my time. I hope for that. I do. And we see that in some of our systems are now recognizing our men and boys. Because as we started to look at this data, our men and boys actually hold statistics at very high rates as well. Again, we're not looking, we're not seeing that. And so we're glad to see that our men and boys are also being considered in this. And again, you know, we talked about some of those reasons why probably not, right? Want to give honor to other task forces working throughout the U.S. Their work helped us build SB 22-150. If they hadn't did the work that they did, we wouldn't have a blueprint for us to have gone from in order for us to get working on ours. So we always give that respect out for all of these pieces, because a pushback was, how do we do this? You know, who's doing this? And we give all that respect to these folks who came in very important clutch to be like, here it is. We did it. We're doing it. Most notably Washington State. The alert system, which we'll talk about here in a few slides, that we got in through the bill, which was something they did not want. I don't care what they tried to tell us. Was based off of the one that's been put out in Washington, and Colorado's missing Indigenous persons alert system will be activated this coming December. Happy Christmas to us all, for sure. So why would Colorado need a missing and murdered Indigenous relatives task force? Does anyone have anything you'd like to share around that? I'll give you the answer a little bit, but I don't pretend to have all the answers. What would you say is the reason why Colorado needs missing and murdered work, whether it be through this task force or at all in any other form or group? I'm gonna give you a little bit of a hint here. So this is a snapshot from BIA. This is how they kind of cut up regions for their service areas. For Colorado, You see a big difference in comparison to our other states here, right? Folks in Colorado, looking at this map, especially because it's a systems map, that Native Indigenous people, they're right there. And that's all there is, right? That's all that's recognized. So in the larger picture, what does that got to do with Colorado? Right? And it was in this frame that our task force came together with the sisters that we have who represent along many of our communities in Colorado. Our sisters out in the cities, our sisters in our tribal communities, our amazing sister who works in the rural community here. And those were the perspectives, the lenses in which we brought this task force together, because we did not want there to be any question that we were talking about absolutely every corner of this state. That we were going to push past this assumption again, right? That these are the only places in which you could find Native Indigenous peoples. Thank you for coming. Have a safe trip. So these are the perspectives that we hope to bring forward. Our tribal perspective, which we know is rich with community and culture. Also experiences a different relationship with the state of Colorado. Our rural communities, whether there are border towns like Durango, or we're talking about all of our rural communities across the state. Folks in Indigenous communities and Indigenous folks in our rural communities have to experience cross-systems navigation, right? Their local systems, as well as perhaps neighboring tribal ones, but townships, relationship to their cultures, racial tensions and lack of representation in their communities, right? They're far oftentimes from home. Whereas a lot of our relatives in our urban communities create those relationships with each other in the cities. But for them, the importance of community relationships with each other across tribal identities is very important and pivotal to their prosperity in their communities in the urban areas, right? Doing amazing work to be there for each other. With building coalition among each other, because they're oftentimes a long ways from their homelands, right? And all they have is each other, which I think is a beautiful element of our indigeneity, is that no matter what peoples you come from, you are my relations. Within each other, we have a bond and understanding our history, our pathway, our journey, our lingering home, our culture, our language. I'm going to break these down individually for y'all to take a look at here. It's a snapshot from my backyard out at Ute Mountain. So in our tribal communities, we spoke a little bit, and thank you for sharing that piece about that jurisdiction of violent crimes. The difficulties we have within our tribal communities to hold folks accountable. In my own community, we do not have yet any tribal code or laws that address sexual assault or domestic violence at this time. We continue to push forward and advocate for that. But if those laws don't exist, right, the level of normalization of that violence, which is a piece here, a sovereignty piece again, Sovereignty should be an empowering way for our tribal governments and our tribal communities to take care of each other, to deal in relationship and business with our state and federal folks. But how it feels on survivors and their families, the way in which we can't hold folks accountable because you're not the right identity or this didn't happen in the right geographical location, is very devastating for survivors and their families and our communities. Go ahead.
Normalized violence is a huge impact on Native communities because this Atari game named Custer's Revenge. You play as a naked Custer. The objective of the game is to rape an Indian maiden tied to a pole.
Wow. He shares with us in gaming and video gaming. There's a game where you get to play Custer, and the objective in that game is to rape Indian maidens in the game. So again, that normalization, it isn't just within our communities, right? Folks are commodifying our identities and our experiences and profiting from it. It's fun. You get the points. Thank you for sharing that. It's very troubling. We have a very serious problem with protection orders being honored outside of our tribal communities and our tribal court systems. I can say that with true certainty as an advocate that this was absolutely an issue. There's supposed to be full faith and credit, which is a way in which those protection orders, any protection order is supposed to be honored no matter where you go. And the best advice that we were given to survivors from my community was to always make sure you carry that protection order on your person 24/7. Because that protection order is not going to show up in any system outside of your reservation. And you wouldn't be believed unless you had it on you. Go ahead.
This is the impact of jurisdiction with on reservations, the federal, the FBI, the sheriff's department, and all these departments are engaged when a missing or murdered Indigenous woman or relative goes missing. So everyone's involved, and it's hard to clear out the ambiguous,
Right.
because everyone has a slice of the pie, even the tribal and outside of the reservation.
Absolutely. Thank you for making that connection for us. This work of missing and murdered, right? Bringing together all of these systems folks, these responders, to hopefully close this issue for us, right? That there's no fight over whose case this is, whose survivor is this, whose crime is this. Who can we arrest, right? Missing and murdered brings together this collaborative of folks, that there is no one who can step out of this, that we are working together to address this in whatever role we can play in it, right? Close up these gaps. Oh.
There's no tribal code for Indians about the tribe. We were wondering, like, how is DD and SA prosecuted? Yeah,
Right.
Yeah, dealt with.
So sexual assault is considered a major crime. So if that survivor reports that, then that's under the jurisdiction of BIA and FBI. And even if they take it, it's up to the U.S. Attorney's Office if they're going to prosecute it. And then we go through again those assumptions, right? Is this a victim or survivor that's going to be believed in trial? For USAOs, that standard is very high. They see other types of cases, civil cases, land cases, things like that, and somehow in there they need to fold in violent crimes. And oftentimes if we have a survivor, a relative who was addicted, happened to be under the influence or at a party when this happened, there's very, very small chance that this case is going to go forward because it would be this person's word against everyone else in the party, potentially the person who harmed them. And oftentimes these are folks who've already been through the system and have been arrested for other things and do not believe with certainty that in this situation they're going to be listened to because they've been arrested maybe days before for something, or maybe they caused harm too in another case and they don't feel that they will be believed or taken seriously. Many reasons, right? So that's what we have to rely on, at least in my community, is BIA calling this particular incident a major crime or something that falls under their scope. And for domestic violence, it depends on the level of injury. If you have a broken bone, they might be able to take it. But in my experience, when I was programming there, oftentimes those calls out were not reported by law enforcement as domestic violence, they were called assaults. And when that happens, in order for USAOs to take it, they need to be called domestic violence and they need to be a certain number of them, which is also an ambiguous number. I was given 5. I was told recently it's 3 now. This person needs to have been charged 4 times before with domestic violence. Before the 5th one, they could be charged as a felon or as a felony domestic violence. Who knows what that even means? And oftentimes the folks that I was providing advocacy for, the person who harmed them had well over 10 assaults with this particular partner, some with others. Not one of them called domestic violence, not one of them reported as domestic violence. It's absolutely horrendous way in which survivors and victims were being assaulted, enduring painful injury. And in my time, a lot of the elder and older survivors were coming forward who had experienced domestic violence in their younger years and were now impacted by those injuries where they were seeing blindness, joint damage, things in their bodies giving out before they really should have at their ages. But because of the domestic violence that they had endured in their younger years with their partners, who by that time had kind of passed on, and there they were wondering if there was any type of supportive services for them, even though this had happened a long time ago. But now I may lose my leg because of this injury, and now I have diabetes, and maybe it would have come from me anyways, but this injury didn't help, right? In my community right now, that is how those things are handled oftentimes. Again, is why it's not everything, but I hold this emergency fund for folks who are looking for some way in which to get some form of healing or a way in which we can help them, at least in the moment. We won't do all the things, but at least somebody will be there to acknowledge and validate that they have endured something very traumatic. Thank you for that question. The lack of adequate law enforcement. My tribe doesn't have its own law enforcement. We rely on the Bureau of Indian Affairs for law enforcement personnel. We rely on BIA for our court. These are not our officers. They rotate out a lot. Oftentimes before they're even able to file their reports, which also made it very difficult for survivors to show up for court. When that officer has already been rotated out to another community and never got that report filed. And so did this incident even happen? That happened a lot. And then within our tribal community, those dynamics of identity and membership, a whole nother level of trauma and erasure, blood quantum If you're not sure of that, Kelsey will share with you all if you want to leave your email address or get in contact with Kelsey. She can share with you our readings. We have some really good readings from Indigenous folks who explore that issue of blood quantum and tribal membership. That piece was was the reason why I left my tribal program. I was discouraged, I guess I'll choose that word, from providing my program services to survivors who did not belong to my tribe. Something I still fundamentally to this day feel is absolutely not the way in which we should be as youth people. How that nurtures that normalization of violence in our communities, that even within each other in our Indigenous communities, that we put each other through a process that says who counts and who doesn't, absolutely still infuriates me. But I hope folks know today that I'm myself a member of my tribe who struggles with a lot of these pieces. I do not see you that way. You should not come into any tribal community and be made to feel as if though your violation of your body doesn't matter because you don't belong to that community. You absolutely do. The lack of resources. Oftentimes our tribal programs are grant reliant and grants come and go so fast. By the time we get someone in place to run these programs, that program has ended, that grant funding has ended, and it's over. The cultural understanding of concepts that create these barriers of understanding, like there's no word for rape in our Indigenous languages. And how that impacts our ability to be able to meaningfully connect with our community members about violence in our language, in our culture. There's something very important that happens in our language when we can speak to these things. We don't have that because that's not who we were. As an instrument of colonization, an instrument, a weapon of war, which I so eloquently hear from amazing colleagues from NAUHZCASA. I absolutely agree. That's an amazing way to word sexual violence on our bodies. And then this piece about how we speak with those who have passed on. You have to give respect for that. So I want to lift this up because we are going to share with you some names that our task force recognizes and acknowledges as relatives who've gone on and are missing. We do so with the most respect as we can. We don't do so thoughtlessly, carelessly. We try to take very good care of these stories and names that we hold and we share with you in this space, and we hope and ask that you do the same to the best of your abilities. I'm also not a lawyer, so I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on all of these pieces, other than to tell you that just like all of those policies that we talked about in the beginning that kind of framed our rights and visibility, so are there a whole slew of policies that determine our public safety, how we navigate the criminal justice, how criminal justice applies to us, how it doesn't, how our rights were given, taken away, and then limited, and then given back, but only kind of, if you can also do A through Z. Survivors and their families have to navigate this system. And as an advocate in our tribal communities, and those of you who are can attest to this, you kind of almost have to be a lawyer yourself to be able to understand these pieces and understand when decisions are made so that we can be with survivors and help them understand why decisions are being made. And oftentimes we're the only supportive resource for them. So oftentimes we are the target of their frustrations. It happened numerous times. It is hard. But again, there are reasons for that. There was intentionality behind that. Just like the erasure, just like those assumptions, just like the way we don't see ourselves and the laws that are supposed to apply to everyone. This is absolutely intentional, intended to be difficult, discouraging. This is a kind of famous I don't know what I'm gonna call this graphic, whatever. This is the reporting structure. This changes all the time also. Have a resource for this if you'd like to look at it, but I believe it's even changed from how it's printed even now. That helps you understand whose jurisdiction is it, whose call is it, and oftentimes folks are out on highways and out on roads with measuring tapes. Law enforcement folks trying to figure out whose call is this, whose case is this. Sometimes it comes down to inches, feet. But I also want you to consider this about that structure. That since 2013, both funding for USAOs, who are the U.S. attorneys' offices, prosecutors in those offices in Indian country, and attorneys to prosecute Indian country cases has decreased by 40%. We had someone from one of our nations here talk about that piece in their community. And USAOs have declined 46%, almost half of sexual assaults, more than half of sexual abuses in Indian countries. Sexual abuse is oftentimes referred to child cases, child rape cases. That is something specifically that our group at NAUHZCASA has called out to FBI and USAOs about. Why is that happening? Why are you declining these cases? And it's not a mystery. You can look it up on the Department of Justice website. It's called declinations, and they have to give a reason why. And oftentimes those reasons are lack of evidence, lack of victim. But when faced with such a daunting and complex system, it's oftentimes really not a mystery as to why survivors and victims do not see their cases through, and why they don't want to cooperate, why they don't want to report. So I want us to always be mindful of what is behind that. Where does that come from? If there's not money being put towards this effort, why not? Why is that? Right? Something to think about in the voting booths, right? We're going to shift to our urban communities, who I oftentimes leaned on my sisters in our urban communities to lead this piece. But I myself lived off and on in Denver for about 10 years. So I feel I can do my best in place of their voice here. So many of the same issues in our tribal communities are also experienced in our urban communities. But with the caveat of a few more, the misidentification piece is huge in our urban Indigenous communities. Our people blend in with so many different communities, races, populations. We are oftentimes misidentified in law enforcement reports as Hispanic, white, everything else, right? But Native American. And that's a huge piece of correcting these, correcting the data that we're hoping to go through, why it's important for our community members like yourselves to be involved in this work, especially where it pertains to SB 22-150. That if you have a family member, a relative, a person from your community who is missing or who was lost here in Colorado, absolutely let our folks know, let the Office of MMIR know that that information needs to be corrected. that your relative is absolutely Native, Indigenous, and should be counted as such. The isolation piece, right, being far from their homelands, creating their own community within their the cities, but also experiencing that lack of support for their culture, their identity, the needs that they have there. And then that lack of the culturally appropriate responses, right? Not having that Native Indigenous specific resource available to them. Our sister Monica's organization, SASO, in Colorado Springs, is the only urban culturally specific advocacy agency that responds to sexual assault, domestic violence, and her scope is regulated to El Paso County. So that's tough for our Native Indigenous DV and SA survivors in Denver, and in our other cities, Grand Junction, right? We don't have those there just yet. Strongly encourage that to happen. Oftentimes we need to become the things that we need. In our rural communities, jurisdiction is still an issue for our Native Indigenous peoples. That reporting structure, where the crime happened, who was involved, what happened, what kind of crime we're talking about. That's important there. In our rural communities, we need to understand the tribal codes, the county and state laws and policies, how they apply to us, how do they apply to survivors. And then again, those limited resources for our Indigenous community members. That access, does it exist? Lots of folks say that they're doing Native Indigenous specific support work in their agencies, and I encourage that if that's a pursuit that they're on. I also hope that they are leaving space in their organization for that to be learned from Native Indigenous people's lived experiences. Please do not take even what I'm saying today as that's going to check off that box for you, because it's not. This is only an introduction to these issues. This is not adequate to say that that is what you're doing because you've listened in on this session. I want to thank you for your time. The limited spiritual traditional resources, education around our cultures, the historical trauma piece, missing and murdered, and how that shows up in our rural communities. The lack of support from our tribal communities, the lack of support from our county and our city community members. Recognizing that racism, the stereotypes, the dehumanization of our Indigenous Native peoples in our rural communities. Something very interesting about proximity to our tribal communities that seems to inspire a lot of this racism in our border towns. If I didn't experience it myself, I probably would think that wasn't the case and that we've moved past that. But it's absolutely still experienced. Even as recent as COVID, as I had shared with you, some of those experiences. It's nothing new. But it's very destructive and hard, especially when those are shelters and advocacy resources that are the only ones that exist for miles. Right? Again, just creating those barriers and obstacles for our survivors. And then why survivors and victims don't come forward and report or see their case through, right? Those supportive services aren't there. I want to take a minute and lift up the resiliency and strength that also exists in our tribal communities. This is work that's being done by members of our tribes within their communities, standing and raising this issue, using their voices, their positions. This was a beautiful remembrance that happened in Ignacio that was organized by our sister Daisy Want to give her that respect for putting this together by herself. And recognizing all the different folks that she did. You notice there are like t-shirts and dresses, and we weren't able to capture all of them, but there were like baby dresses and things like that, just not wanting to forget anyone, and every single one of them was attached with the identity and partial story of these folks that we were talking about, that we were trying to remember in this effort. And then these are our sisters of our color guard for Ute Mountain. These are veterans who were absolutely pivotal in the work that we did with SB 22150. Helped us kind of move our tribal leaders along and align with us. So we always want to give that honor up to our Native Indigenous veterans who stood with us and were one of the first group of folks who signed on as supporters for SB 150. So this is kind of our wish list as a task force, what we were looking for. Again, built upon the work of those other task force work and their legislations that they got through in their states. We were looking to improve that coordination, response, communication, and awareness of missing and murdered, much like we talked about, calling for our systems folks to come together and work together in collaboration and in respect of each other to close up these gaps, to help eliminate these barriers, obstacles, excuses, to address the jurisdictional complications and that lack of protocol of how these agencies are supposed to cooperate and work together. We wanted something that was going to address that poor and inconsistent reporting mechanism. Again, that misidentification piece. Our responders even asking about that. So that way we can get that data corrected and centralized. We wanted that to be able to address this issue around that misclassification and address that in the missing person records, both moving forward and in the past. We currently don't have, but hopefully we are on the way to that. But this was again our wish list before we started the bill, a response specific to missing and murdered Indigenous relatives in Colorado. And we wanted that coordinated response between agencies because we know that it can lead to more effective actions, better outcomes, better communication with our relatives about how our folks are being looked for and what's going on in their cases. I want to lift up that this is absolutely driven by communities, community members, supportive agencies. During our committee testimony, we heard from so many family members and relatives throughout Colorado and folks outside of Colorado who are still looking for their loved ones lost here in Colorado, folks we didn't even know about, right? I also want to encourage you to keep your eyes out for legislative action because those are open calls for your testimony, and those stories and experiences were incredibly helpful to get this thing passed through. And I thank you if you were one of the folks who provided us your testimony and opened up those wounds with us. I know that was not easy, but your words and your family helped push this forward, and this only exists because you found it in yourself to be able to do that. Those were hard things to hear, hard things to say for sure, and I truly do appreciate that. MMIR impacts statewide and nationwide, right? We wanted to break through those assumptions about and that effort to keep this issue centered at our tribal communities. So absolutely, our tribes, right? We talked about that, are lacking those resources, but also folks should respect where our leaders are, whether it be detrimentally to us as community members or not. And I also want to highlight that our tribal leaders were also a part of building this bill, this legislation, and at no time asked for there to be additional agents put in their communities. They didn't ask for that. What we asked for is statewide, everyone's responsibility in response to this issue. We have much more work to gauge more of these different experiences, needs, and guidance. We don't believe even in that effort that we heard from absolutely everyone. We don't pretend to be experts in all of your experiences. We learn more every single day with every interaction we have, learning about new relatives that we didn't know about. So absolutely encourage you to come forward and share. Let us know what we're missing. We should never leave anyone behind. This is SB 22-150 and it's completed form, short, 15 pages long. I have to make sure that we add this slide in here to distinguish this, right? Because what ended up happening was this bill and the office that it creates is also called Missing and Murdered Indigenous Relatives. We are the task force. Our task force is grassroots effort, right? We all had full-time jobs, and on top of that, we worked to organize, to bring together a coalition, a legislative committee of Indigenous people to help us push this forward. That when this office is up and running and that director is in that position, that we hope folks remember, and we're here to help you through that. To know that who it is that you're talking to, and we will make every effort to work with that office director and make sure that we pass you along to that office for that piece. For us, we do provide support to family members of, and do what we can to help organize a call for justice. We will come to court with you where we are able to. We are very small. It is just us sisters right now. We hope to grow that. We hope that this sits and inspires you to absolutely start your own movement. Let us know if you want to be a part of it. We absolutely would love to have volunteers. Because what's important is we should not ever let one of our relatives stand alone. We should stand together, win or lose, right? As the Missing and Murdered of Colorado Task Force, we organized the legislative committee of stakeholders, community leaders, tribal leaders, legal teams. We worked tirelessly up until the night before this was passed even to engage and come to an understanding about how this should move forward. We also included the work of organizations who work intersectionally with work that intersects with missing and murdered, like the human trafficking organization, which is called the Laboratory to Combat Human Trafficking. Missing and murdered named relatives showed up for us. Tribal coalitions from all of our surrounding states and beyond. Domestic violence and sexual assault coalitions. So absolutely those pieces that I hesitated about, all of those folks in those fields showed up, gave testimony and signed on as supporters and stood with us in this issue in Colorado. We engaged with bipartisan support with our state legislators. I had so many meetings, and so did some of our sisters on the ground there at the Capitol in Denver. I did all of my work virtually from home, which I think is so amazing. I never even had to leave Towaoc, and got to meet with and talk with so many senators and representatives here in Colorado from both political parties and everything in between. And we had such amazing support, and I want to lift that up. We are in some politically tense times right now, for sure. But I also want to assure and acknowledge that it was across the board we found that support. We have found very little and our representatives, and senators who opposed to this effort and this bill, in its entirety. This was before we had to make some edits towards the end, but, these folks stood with us, and we had very little pushback when we were, pushing it through, the legislative system, and made it through every committee, unanimously. So what does it do? I'm going to break down each of these pieces to know what that means. So for implementing best practices, it's going to improve protocols and policies for law enforcement and how they respond to missing and murdered. It's going to create a process for them to be able to correct those inaccurate pieces in data gathering. So we're hoping that this is going to confront that issue of misclassification. It's going to develop and facilitate training of law enforcement, first responders, folks, courts, healthcare systems, other relevant agencies on MMIR, including cultural awareness and sensitivity for those cases. And we are not going to let those historical aspects get buried, and make sure that these responders know that there's absolutely nothing historical about those violences. It's going to improve investigations by conducting reviews of cold cases and cases that were ruled suicide or overdose or under suspicious circumstances. We want these things looked into, right? It's going to provide technical assistance to the office of MMIR and the federal, state, tribal, and law enforcement agencies on these cases of missing and murdered persons, and coordinate with FBI and neighboring states on cold cases and identifying repeat offenders. It's going to increase communication by developing and enhancing those relationships that we talked about, making sure everyone knows they're a part of this and have a piece in it. In order to address that mistrust of and the injustices within our criminal justice system, to help our survivors know we're working towards a place where they'll be seen, they'll be believed, they'll count. Communicating missing Indigenous person reports of registered members of tribes to their appropriate homelands, so that our tribal communities know where their people are or have been found. And provide guidance and assistance to victims' families in navigating the legal and missing person systems. We have very cool people who are advocates in our CBI office. Her name is Hazel. Shout out Hazel. She's amazing. She has offered herself up specifically if you have any issues with that reporting piece and the missing person system and things like that. So please reach out to us, and we are happy to connect you with her. And she is working towards holding space for our Indigenous peoples. And we continue to work to keep holding her accountable to that, which she has welcomed openly, which we appreciate. Increasing this communication piece is also about that greater awareness and transparency. So this bill is going to create an interactive dashboard specific to missing and murdered Indigenous relatives about cases, affiliations, geographical information, case results, and resources for victims and families. And that transparency piece is that this office is going to have to report every year to these committees in our state capitol and to the public about MMIR cases, how their work's going, and recommendations about those changes, how it's going and how it should be moving forward. It's going to improve those CBI protocols. CBI is the Colorado Bureau of Investigations. That database piece, they're the ones who manage that for Colorado and make that public. Make those investigations public. So we're looking for someone. We will all be notified of that alert system, which we, the task force did help with, and look forward to seeing launched this coming December. And again, that transparency piece and accountability piece that they will have to submit reports every year about the use and the success rates of that alert system and the database information, making sure that they're using it and we're tracking how helpful it's been. And if it's not, we're going to go back to the drawing board and make sure that we are continuing to improve where it needs to be so that this system is doing what it's supposed to do to keep our community safe and bring our relatives home. This office is going to be led by a director who is going to be appointed by the Executive Director of Public Safety, who's going to hopefully work connecting with tribes, our Indigenous communities, with those criminal investigations. We hope that this will be staffed by Indigenous folks who understand this experience and will coordinate with these other organizations. Again, just to keep us all together, keep that communication line in peace, keeping us accountable and moving forward with learning how to do better. This person will also develop and facilitate trainings on this and hopefully bring forward their experiences in that office to help kind of refine this picture for Colorado, because we really don't know. We don't know what that true picture looks like for our state. We're hoping that this director will do so. We also will see in December a rollout of a new curriculum for our law enforcement officers coming out of the academy with post, who are the ones who are responsible for that training piece. They are required now to make sure that they have in their post training missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. It's not just a section of their training. They have to integrate this throughout the entirety. So they don't get to just talk about some parts and then they get a little section on our communities and our experiences. It's going to be throughout. And then also to support, this director is going to support and inform its advisory board, which we also wrote in there because we wanted this director to have the best support in their work moving forward, that they weren't going to be left as one person to speak for all Native Indigenous peoples and their families here in Colorado. Again, you know, we try not to stand alone. So we wanted an advisory board to support this director and also to make sure that this office is doing what it's supposed to do, right? And we have named seats who should sit in those seats, that they have to meet. We really had to direct all of these pieces because we know that when folks are left to their own devices to decide what is best for us, what it should look like, they're not going to hit those marks. And so that's also why this board is important, to make sure that folks with lived experiences, those of us from our Indigenous communities and identities, are informing this office and their work. And then also folks who hold those expertise and those different intersecting experiences, like SA, DV, trafficking, as well as tribally appointed representatives, to make sure that we give our tribal communities a voice at this table as well. Are there any questions so far about the bill? I know that was a lot. And really, we won't know until we let them have a go at it, how it's going and all of those things. But that is what we hope to see launched in the coming months. Cool. So what can we do to support Indigenous communities? We ask that you be intentional when you educate and inform yourselves and your organization, including your boards, right, your decision makers, about our Indigenous communities, about where the roots of violence, where the roots of missing and murder comes from, understanding those history pieces, how our people are talked about in our educational settings, and ask yourselves where your understanding of our people comes from. We hear a lot that historical trauma piece is absolutely true and valid and real, but it is very much present day. It's not locked away in our history, it's in our DNA, right? Much of those same struggles faced during colonization, we're still in colonization, make no mistake of that. They're still impacting us today. The impact of mascots and border town violence is very real. You know, we have something locally going on around that, right? That absolutely feeds into that normalization and that ignorance about who we are and how it helps our systems and our communities to overlook us, to cartoonize us. It's not a real word, I needed it. You can't use it, just kidding. Understand that our community members are and have been countless times used for funding purposes. Just had a meeting yesterday about this. Be accountable if you're going to say that you are servicing our Native Indigenous people. They better exist in your organization in a meaningful way if you're asking for money for serving us, right? And if you're going to ask us to come to your organization to help you learn about this, to do this intentional work, make sure that you take care of us. Make sure you respect what we have to say. Make sure you give people something for their time. I'm not about monetizing our culture, but if you're gonna ask of us of our traumas, you should try to find a way to balance that for us and with us. Stand with us when we are calling for justice, we are calling for action. And we were just there in your organization, helping you and your board hold space for Native Indigenous people, stories of survivors. Your organization better show up with us when we got a problem with your township or your county or your court folks, right? It doesn't just end there where you get to look like you're a conquering hero and your organization is helping us and saving us. Only we can save us. Make no mistake of that. Show up and show often. Don't just show up when it counts best for you or it's most advantageous. Come when it's uncomfortable. It's going to be uncomfortable for a long time. I'm not promising you a cozy spot to sit in community with me, but I do promise you that if you're intentional, I'm intentional, we'll get someplace better together with that mutual respect and honor. And think about the makeup in your agency about representation. A lot of the main reasons why our Native Indigenous survivors and community members do not come to your organization for support is because we don't see ourselves in the work that you're doing. We don't see ourselves in your staff. Your dream catcher hung up on the wall doesn't count. In our work as a task force, we work very hard to do training and education. If I can in some way help you in your work at your organization, community, I would absolutely love to nurture that voice within yourself to do it because I could use the help. If it sounded like I'm missing stuff, it's because I am. And I hope so, because I hope that that's you. I hope that you're the one who holds that, and that you're going to pick this up, take it further and wider than I ever could. In this work, we hope to disrupt those cycles of violence and call out those things that are hard for us to sit with, those realities, those truths. We want to emphasize prevention, proactive work, which should be done through the voices of members of our communities, because that is the most meaningful way, right? I truly appreciate the experts who visit our communities to do this piece, but we should be those things too for ourselves so that our children, our nieces, our nephews, our uncles, our grandpas, our grandmas can see that I'm saying this. I'm telling you that this is an issue. I'm telling you this is what we need to do. This is what's happening. And we can do this. And we can do this because you see me here with you. We can do this together. It's important that these words and these teachings, this awareness, it's cycle breaking, they come from us. We lift up and hope to promote more Native Indigenous advocacy, making sure that folks are truly being culturally specific and practicing that humility, seeking more information, seeking to do better. We support and provide law enforcement specific training. I've done some of that. It's a tough road. My cheat code is my dad has been in law enforcement all my life, so I picture him when I see cops in the room. So that's helpful to me. Thankful to him for that. We want to develop toolkits that will be helpful in our communities. One way in which we started out with is something we call honoring way, and that's the way for us to hold events that are organized, that we make sure that we are taking care of everyone at these things, and I hope that you all will today as well. Please take those steps to take care of yourself, however that needs to happen. I hope that you carry these things with you, but in a good way. As hard as these things work, I hope you find empowerment, strength in these things. These are not easy things to even for me to say, no matter how many times I've said them in the past years. Returning evidence and in doing that, that's honoring bodies to families and survivors. So in speaking with folks who oversee that piece here in Colorado, there are absolutely ways in which you can get things returned to you that were taken for evidence, especially if you are a survivor of sexual violence. I know these are not easy things and not everyone wants that, but I know that for some of us culturally, those are pieces of us that are still out there somewhere, and that it is a right of yours to want to get those things back and put them away, and through ceremony or however means you'd like that, and make sure that you are returned to whole, however that means, however that looks for you. Please reach out to me if you have questions around that. Much like a lot of pieces I am hoping happens moving forward, but there are a lot of capabilities that were there. It's just that no one ever asked the question. So please ask the questions. And if you need to, please let me know. I'm happy to direct you to who you can ask those questions to. Always ask questions. So what do we do now? I hope that you own your voice as Native Indigenous relatives here and who are still listening in with us. Thank you for sitting with me today, tonight. Tell your story. I know that's easier said than done, but I hope that you're owning your story and you are getting to a place where you can do that, especially survivors. That's a hard one to tell. And know that there are advocates in our communities. And if you don't know of one, let me know, because I have a really awesome network of folks in our tribal communities that I could probably hook you up with that can help you with that. I'll help you with that. Reach out. Again, you don't have to stand alone. Build your support, build your coalition, build your relationships. This bill, this law passed because of that, because we were in community and relationship with each other. It was us as moms and aunties and grandmas, fathers, uncles, nieces. We did this. Everyday people, just like you all. We did this. I did not have to be elected to any office to see this through. None of us did. That would have been helpful. But we did that. There's power in who you are already. Do not let any part of our experience as Native Indigenous folks take any piece of that away. And if it weren't so, there would be such a targeted effort to remove that and erase that from us. Absolutely, you are powerful. Together, we are even more so. And also remember, you don't owe anyone your stories, right? Think about where that's going, how it's going to be used. Ask for that accountability. If any of these organizations reach out to you and ask for your help on something, you absolutely have a right to know what's gonna happen with it. What's gonna change? What are they gonna do with it? You have absolutely a right to how that story is told, and who you tell it to, especially with media folks. We have a very amazing media person at CCASA who does really great prep work with survivors, especially where media interviews can be done. I encourage you to prep yourself for that. Be very thoughtful and careful about that, because media can be powerful and important, and they also aren't always your friends in terms of that. So you have absolutely a right to not share your story. Our leaders are helpful, and also you are a leader too. There's a constant power that exists in your community member identity. That was a huge component for us. It continues to be one even today in all of you. Again, I want to encourage you to stay involved in our legislative initiatives. Many aspects and intersecting issues connect with missing and murdered, including houselessness, domestic violence, sexual assault, trafficking, poverty, health inequities, economic abuses, child and elder abuse, neglect, and accountability from our systems. And I absolutely encourage you, as an advocate of survivors, believe survivors, please. There's so many ways in which they are going to be told that what happened to them didn't happen to them. Please be that for the survivor in your life, in your family, in your community. It costs you nothing, but it means the world to us. We're now going to share these names that we acknowledge at our task force. Again, it's not complete, it's not finished, it lives. Please let us know if your relative isn't named here. We'll make sure we correct that and honor that. Thank you for holding that space for our relatives. A message to our white allies, partners. We respectfully ask that you strive to be our allies working as partners with a common goal, and your intention to allow us to lead in our experiences and our stories, to undo the years of oppression and the impacts that we carry in our lives and in our bodies today. We ask that you understand that trust is built in a process through action, not just words or pictures. We ask that you expand your understanding of the historical context for violence against Native peoples. We ask that you consider your role in supporting our right to self-definition. Understand that we are not monoliths either. We come in all different shapes, shades, sizes, languages, beliefs. We always ask that you be mindful about tokenism. We know what that feels like. We know when that's happening to us. And absolutely Native Indigenous liberation. is and will always be found within Native Indigenous lives and spirit. We know the way. We are the experts of our lives. We will find this way. Thank you all. Thank you all online. We're still hanging with us. This is how you can get in contact with our task force. This is how you can get in contact with us individually. I also understand that in our own tribal communities, oftentimes we have conflict, and you may not feel as if though, especially if you belong to mine, that you can't come to me with things. I absolutely honor and respect that and understand. There are many more task force sisters that are there to hold that space for you and hold that understanding. And I encourage you to continue to doing your own work, however that shows up for you, whatever your capacity is. If we can support you in any movement you've got going on, or organization or organizing you're doing, events, ideas, absolutely reach out to us. If there's ways in which we can be doing better, we always strive to be doing that as well, because we are also accountable to our relatives as our accountables are accountable to us. So thank you so much for your time.